Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Windows on the World. It's Wednesday and it's 9 o'clock. Special guest tonight is John Waters. John is working on a court case in Ireland, and they've been to the court a couple of times. Himself and Gemma Docherty, they've faced a real load of abuse from the press. And we're going to get into all that. We're going to get into what the case is about. The case is about turning over the draconian COVID-19 laws and the laws that accompany it. But our recent show actually did a very good one with Kieran Boyle last night on Alternative News. And we got into some very deep, interesting issues. So do have a look at that, because we covered a big, wide area. And the wider the area at the moment, the better, because I think we're all over the target. The people I know certainly are anyway. Last time we did a show was main show was the AI robots of COVID-19. And that was really all about how the whole system is being replaced and taken over, and businesses are going to be collapsed. Everything's going into alternative kind of agenda, which is basically the AI rollout, artificial intelligence. And I talked about that in some detail on that show. In other words, what's happening is this rollout of artificial intelligence cannot account for unpredictability. So our kind of strategy here has to be about unpredictability within this system, because this AI system is being introduced for everything, and they're talking about universal basic income, and that is going to be the future. Loads of people are going to go under, self-employed especially, obviously, and lots of small businesses are going to be taken down. But I've been talking about this and what's called the fourth industrial revolution for a long time. We're actually also in the fourth world wilderness, the wilderness of the mind, the borderless world with no continents and no countries, no governments, but basically everything run on artificial intelligence. Now, this is interesting, because if you look at our government over the past few weeks, you'll realize that they don't need to be there. They're already talking on the World Economic Forum website about basically replacing these public servants or prime minister, doesn't matter, replacing people with AI. So everything is run through corporate artificial intelligence. Now, whether this all happens or not is basically up to the way people engage with it. But we have a big problem in this country at the moment. Look at what's happened. Look how compliant the public are. Look how they're going along with this. Now, the other issue here is not that we need to protest. It needs to be strategic action. And what do the other side call what they're doing? Strategic intelligence. So we're going to get into all that tonight. And we're going to get into what the bigger picture of this whole rollout really is. I've got a very special guest, John Waters, and he's an Irish writer. Started his career in 1981 with the Irish music journal Hot Press. John later wrote in the Irish Times from 1990 to 2014. And John has been absolutely attacked, along with Gemma Docherty, by the mainstream media, and it was absolutely incredible. When they went to court the other day, the only question that came from the mainstream media was, why are you not social distancing? You couldn't make up how banal things have come. But basically, this is what we're in at the moment. This is the fourth world. But yeah, John's written many books actually, and his book in 2012 it's quite a good title actually for tonight. It's called Why Ireland Lost the Plot. And John and Gemma are trying to bring the plot back to Ireland. So without further ado, I'm going to bring John on. We've already done a show on RBN, Republic Broadcasting News Network. In fact, we've done two shows on RBN. So go back into the archive for those. But I'm going to welcome John now to Windows on the World. John, hi.
Hello.
Hi. Great to see you. And we've had some very interesting chats over the last week or so, and what you're doing resonates with me so much, and it's so important, and it's getting so little attention. It's a disgrace in a way that you're sat here at 9 o'clock tonight. You should be talking to media from all over the world, in my opinion. So we're going to try and get this out there as much as possible, but just for the benefit of people who are watching, and as this goes on, can you give us a little bit of a background? Just tell us a bit about your background as a writer, when you started seeing the signs of decay within society, and what you're doing at the moment, and why you've got into this taking on of the Irish government.
Well, I was a columnist, a feature writer and columnist with the Irish Times from 1990, and I was also a reporter for a period. So I've been around the whole beast, you know, and For the first 5 years in the Irish Times, I guess it was fairly controversial because I had particular areas of interest, so particularly nationalism and Irish history that I was, and the countryside, the rural countryside where I came from, and outside the cities. So that's a big interest of mine, and because they were being totally run into the ground, and so I was, I suppose, outside of the loop in terms of the Irish Times, which is a very left liberal newspaper even then. But in 1996, I had a daughter in a very difficult situation, and I found suddenly that I had no rights as a father, and I couldn't believe this. A single father, no rights, and still responsibility. And society expects you to step up, but they won't give you anything to work with. So I started to write out of this experience, and I had already written a play on that very subject by sheer, I don't know, what you would call it, coincidence or something, a couple of years before, even though I had no sense of any person, no personal experience of it. A play called Long Black Coat, which is kind of after a Bob Dylan song. And but then I noticed immediately that everything changed for me, because people who had previously regarded me as just a kind of a harmless eccentric from the country now seemed to regard me as a serious threat, because I was actually going all the time at feminism, at the whole gender agenda, and things like that, and talking about family courts and the demonization of men, and propaganda against men, and male suicide. And why was that? Why were male suicides 4 or 5 times higher than female suicides? And all these questions which nobody ever asked before in Ireland. There were some people like in the UK, like Neil Linden, and others, in America, who were talking about these things. But in Ireland, it was unheard of, and it was completely, in the Irish Times, sacrilegious, heretical. And I started having a very bad time there. And that kind of changed me in an awful lot of ways, because it made me realize that the entire agenda of the left liberal establishment was completely bogus, that it wasn't actually based in justice and truth or anything like those concepts, but it was an ideological agenda which had a specific destination point, which was, I wasn't sure what. I didn't know what that was. And I gradually formulated these, I was learning as on the job and trying to talk to other people. And we were floundering a bit, in the dark. I didn't have really much to go on, but I kept going. And then as things went on, I got sucked into other things from that. I found myself being written to by hundreds of men, and the mothers of men, and the new partners of men who were being abused and brutalized in family courts. And the next thing then I found, I was actually getting contacted by people who were coming to Ireland from the United Kingdom with their children on the run from social services, who wanted to forcibly adopt their children, and they would be going to court. And of course, I would try to help them and write about them, but of course I had terrible trouble doing that. But in any event, I ended up in 2012, when I think the world sort of shifted on its axis sometime just after 2012. But we had a referendum then, which is called the Children's Rights Referendum, which I opposed with about 3 other people in the country. There was like 4 of us on one side, and then the rest of the country on the other side. And in the course of that case, that referendum, it was to give rights to children, ostensibly, but in fact it was to take rights from parents and give them to the state. That was the real purpose. And I opposed this, and we took a legal action in the middle of that. A guy called Mark McChrystal headed up the case, and we won the case. I was a witness in that case, and we won it. We showed up the state for having engaged in propaganda using taxpayers' money. But the result, the judgment only came about 4 days before the referendum, and the court refused to cancel the referendum or even postpone it. And so we lost, but relatively marginally. We got 42% of the vote, which is pretty impressive for 4 people, I think you'll agree. So that was the start of it. And then I got involved in the gay marriage thing, and for the same reason, because the Irish Constitution is fundamentally, I think, the best constitution in the world, or was before 2012, when the process of breaking it up started. And this is what they've been doing. They use what seem to be important issues, but they're issues which never happened before. Children's rights, gay marriage. I mean, if you said to somebody 20 years before the words gay marriage, they would think you were making a joke of some kind, but now suddenly this was the most important right of the century, and this, of course, was really not about gay marriage at all. It was about destroying the Irish Constitution. particularly Article 41, which was about the family and defining the family, safeguarding the family, defining parenthood, safeguarding parenthood, and so on. And of course, it did, in my view, as I've been kind of implying, require some modification for the modern world, where single parents were completely outside, single fathers were completely without rights constitutionally. But I would not, even though I had been fighting that case, I would have been very careful in terms of how you would adapt the existing constitutional provisions, because this is a very dangerous process. So I was writing out of that experience. And the same thing then in 2018, when they brought in an amendment or a referendum to take away the right to life of the unborn child. And again, we lost those to a referendum. So now the Constitution is, the three articles, the most important articles in the Constitution, 40, 41 and 42, have been destroyed. But in this action we're taking, myself and Gemma, there are other articles which are still there and still intact, and they're also fundamental rights, the right to free, they're essentially fundamental freedom rights, the right to assembly, the right to free movement, the right to speak your mind, all these things. And they're the ones that we're going to be trying to protect now in this action. And it's the first action, as far as I know. There have been a couple of other actions, one in Germany, which was kind of, it kind of went a bit nasty because the person who took it, who was a lawyer, was actually ended up in jail. Yeah. And then there was one in Czechia, and or what used to be the Czech Republic. And that was quite a narrow technical thing, actually. It seems to be about really that the legislation was passed or signed into law by a minister rather than by the parliament. And they have had time to mend their hand. I assume that's been done. I haven't seen an update on that story. But it's a minor enough thing anyway. It was purely a technical thing which could have been rectified, or I guess has been rectified by now on their terms. I don't really know enough about the Czech constitutional situation to be able to comment on that.
That's a really good introduction, John. Yeah, and that's put everything into context. Now, the thing is about this, what I can't really understand, and I think what we've talked about over the past couple of shows that we've done, is that nobody else seems to be behind this in any major way. I would have thought that there would have been at least a few barristers line up. We had Lord Sumption in this country who expressed his dissatisfaction with the whole thing. Yeah. But there's a lot of other people who could have come out. Now, yeah. I think this is a huge problem. And your reference there to the family courts is a massive wake-up call to anybody who thinks that we have a judicial system that has anything to do with what they think is the common good. The common good is all about this new system. It's all about what appears to be in the public interest to the public, and everything is hidden. So what we also get is these cases that appear to be held in private. And that is a massive problem in this country, and not a lot of people know about it. For instance, things like the Child Support Agency, we were finding out that they were holding these in private to steal property through the CSA. And that led me into looking at how the county court, the administrative courts were actually working, and what an administrative court actually is. It's nothing like what people think it is. We're talking about a different system here that people don't understand. We don't have to go into the sort of details of admiralty law, but I've studied all this stuff, and it goes back a long way in law. But what seems to have happened is that this usurping of inalienable rights of the person for what they call the common good. And this is called communitarianism. And it's a totalitarian system that doesn't respect the rights of the individual, which I think is what you were emphasizing in the first part of the show there. Yeah, it's the inalienable rights, or inalienable rights that come from God. Yeah, carry on, John.
That's exactly right. You see, what's happening here really is that a common law system, which is the fundamental system in the United Kingdom, in England, arising from the English law, common law, and also in America, and to a huge extent in Ireland, although we have our written constitution as well. But that's the practice that we have. It's based on common law. It's one of the layers of law that we use. That's fundamentally based on the idea that we are all free men. We are all free to start with, and then that freedom can only be circumscribed to the absolute minimalist extent on a completely proportionate basis according to the necessity to meet what you call the common good. But it's a sense that, you know, the rights, where to prevent the rights of one person crashing into the rights of another all the time, type of thing. You know, it's just literally tailoring those rights a little bit in principle, or in situations where there are conflicts and disputes. And that's kind of how the common law works. And really now there is an attempt to get rid of this and shift that to a system of rights whereby they are essentially concessions of the state, that the state makes you free. The state offers you freedom on a qualified basis, and only if you behave in certain ways. And that's what they're trying to do.
Yes, and it also comes with responsibilities, John. In other words, this new system is all about, you have certain rights, but with those rights come responsibilities. And the responsibility is for, what I was talking about, the common good. Now, the common good doesn't mean what people think. It doesn't mean that what's good for everybody. It means what appears to be good for the way society is perceived to function. And that is a very different thing. So society has to be seen to function in a certain way, to give what the people who are running it view as a certain amount of stability. They need people to believe in a system that appears relatively stable, but that doesn't mean that it's a justice system. And this is the main problem that the public have with misunderstanding what they are within the system, that within this system you are property unless you can prove otherwise. You prove otherwise by becoming competent, but these are kind of details in a way, but they're very important details as to how we're governed, because I think to lay this out properly, people have to know what they are in the system. But if you are competent in the system and the laws that are coming in are not in the real public interest, these draconian laws are on the back of what is now looking more and more like a contrivance. And that is being proven. So in other words, when ministers bring in these laws, they have to have validity. They have to have something behind them. They have to actually have content. And a point that I made, I think, was that the whole thing with the layout of what they've done is they've bypassed pretty much everything that was an inalienable right. Now, under the UN Human Rights Act, we lost our rights, our real rights, because in the Human Rights Act under the UN, it says we have a right as a person before the law. Well, a person doesn't have rights. Only people who actually enforce their rights or actually impose their rights have rights. You don't naturally have rights. And that's a thing that a lot of people don't understand, because that common law kind of jurisdiction is now usurped, and it has been for quite a long time. But as far as the government goes, there is no evidence that an order of staying at home is safe, beneficial, or necessary, and it is believed that none exists. That's in a negative averment. In other words, what they're saying is based on a fraud. And the UK government has been wrongly advised by lobbyists, and that's now clear. So that really does render all of these draconian measures null and void from the start. In other words, ab initio.
I would say that from my own experience of writing about family law over the years, that a lot of this this corruption started out in family law and in the secret courts, the in-camera courts that were, the nature of those courts, of family law courts, for reasons that they claimed was to protect families, but of course it was to protect the process and the judges and the lawyers. And what happened there essentially in America and in Britain and Ireland and in other countries increasingly, although their law system, legal systems in Europe are different, they're the Napoleonic system and they're quite different to ours. It was really a situation, it was a kind of a trick that was played as a result of the introduction of divorce. Because normally, in the normal sense of a marriage is a contract between two people legally, and it's nobody else's business really. But what they've actually done is construct a system where you're forced to go into the civil courts. And then those civil courts, through the process of secrecy, somehow managed to turn into quasi-criminal courts, which can penalize people. And what they've done as a result of the process in those, they've essentially done away with concepts of presumption of innocence and so on in those kind of quasi-criminal contexts, so that somebody can be actually locked up now for non-payment of maintenance or something like that, and even falsely or even unjustly when the evidence won't be listened to. And what you're actually finding that in a lot of other contexts then, to do with particularly this new identity politics and things like that those concepts now, those warped, perverted concepts are leaching out into the mainstream of law and into the court system, where now you find that, for example, in rape cases, there is a kind of an assumption now in the system already, cultural assumption, that somebody who accuses somebody else of rape should not be interrogated in court, that they must be, quote unquote, believed, prima facie, and that there's no question of any proper investigation, that the accusation is the conviction, is the sentence, as it were, which is kind of the ethic of the family law system. And that has reached out now. And now what we're seeing, ironically, myself and Gemma, ironically now, this is amazing to be talking these things now in this week, when we have been fighting. The first battle we fight in the court, every day we go in now, is about the fact that the courts have been cleared of people. For the first time, completely contrary to the Irish Constitution, they have cleared, and what should be an open court, it's not a family court, they won't allow the public in. In fact, there's a ring of steel around the court that won't allow them now within 500 yards of the courthouse. And this is explained to us on the basis, all kinds of spurious basis, that the press, laughably, the press are there, so they will give the public an honest account. Well, and all of this guff and nonsense, which is clearly unconstitutional. But what you see here now is that the process that happened in the family court, which I went through myself, which was essentially the court making up the rules on the hoof, is now out in the open, and they don't care. They're quite barefaced about it, and absolutely determined that they're going to face down all criticisms and all questioning and just continue on as if there was no higher law anywhere to be found.
Yeah, I think there's a Roman maxim, ignorance of the law is no excuse. And I think that is very relevant to what's going on at the moment. But when you bring in this quasi-criminal thing, that is very interesting, because that's where bailiffs' companies were deregulated. So a bailiff used to work directly for the court. Now they're merely bonded to a court. They have to pay a bond to a court, and they work in private. So those people who come round to your house and say that they have powers of arrest do not have powers of arrest. They have an ability to kidnap you if you consent. And I went through this years ago. It's a very interesting thing, because a friend of mine was being pursued by the child support agency for money that he didn't owe. They'd gone to his parents' house because they didn't have his address, and they said there was a warrant out for his arrest. So Marston's bailiffs decided there was a warrant out for his arrest. We found out, of course, there wasn't, but he decided to go to court for what turned out to be a committal to prison. So he walks into the court and he says, I enter this court with my inalienable rights intact. And they said, in that case, you can't come in. You can't come in. So they stopped him going into court for a committal to prison hearing, because, of course, it wasn't a committal to prison hearing. Because what happens is you phone up the police. Is there a warrant out for my arrest? No. It's all fraud, basically, and coercion. Now, this is a problem with what? Yes. Yeah.
That's exactly it. I mean, that's what essentially divorce law is. Like, you see, they give you the impression that they have the right to interfere in your marriage, and that you are immediately, ipso facto, subject to the court. But the court can only work in relation to your marriage if you consent, if you show up. And if you don't, then you can write a polite letter to the court and say, thank you very much for your interest in my marriage, but I'm quite happy with my marriage and I intend it to continue, and I'm happy to enter into negotiation and mediation with my wife as is prescribed by law. So thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon to you. But what most people don't know, because they go to a lawyer, the lawyer doesn't tell them that. The lawyer tells, oh, you better get your defense in. And the next thing, the whole thing's on. And once you walk into that court, you have issued permission to the court to judge you and give you their verdict and impose that on your life and on your children's life. And most people just don't know this kind of thing.
No, another very important thing is to counterclaim. Now, a counterclaim, you do have to actually have a legitimate claim, but a counterclaim in kind of financial transactions is 3 times plus damages, and I've done that several times, and it does work, because then you go in as a counterclaimant. And it's very important with this administrative law, like the police do this, they started to issue notices of intended prosecution, and they're involving themselves in third-party matters. In other words, these matters aren't criminal, they're civil. They're starting to involve themselves in civil cases now, and this is very disturbing. But the way to deal with it is, it's a very important thing, this, with their paperwork, and it doesn't matter whose paperwork it is. If you supply your own paperwork, you don't have to fill in anything. So these implied third-party contracts that may even contain prioris, which are predetermined liquidated damages asking you for money, they are nil and void if they're from a company, and most of these people are working for companies. So that's a very important thing to know, and that's what we found out with the Child Support Agency and CMEC. In fact, the people who are known as the deadbeat dads in this country actually brought the whole thing down. But we proved that there was fraud going on in the county court, in private, and the bailiffs were acting in private with people they knew in the court. The property was stolen in the court, and the preferred estate agents were auctioning the property to their preferred buyers. So it was all private from beginning to end. When people were getting taken to court to these fake amounts being given up, then the next thing is it goes into county court, which is in private, and then a private bailiff company comes and kicks your door in, takes your property on the back of a fraudulent warrant, a warrant that is not high court. So what you have to do is you have to get into the high court at that point. You have to go straight to Queen's Bench. And if you don't go to Queen's Bench, then you've had it. I said that to a master in the Royal Courts of Justice, and he said, right, okay, you need to turn up at court, but... And I said, but what? And he said, there is some doubt as to whether judicial review runs to the county court. What he meant was get it out of the county court, because that's where all this fraud is happening. And people don't know this. I know a friend of mine, he's lost his entire estate, which was 2 flats in Pimlico, because he uncovered a fraud. And he uncovered a fraud which was to do with the City of London, and it was to do with television stations who were making money when their lines were closed. And he exposed it all. But these people have friends in high places. Yeah, go on, John. Sorry.
Sorry, we're getting a little bit off the track, but this is important. And I just want to say one thing before we get back on, because you use a phrase there that's really, we need to nail, because there's so much prejudice generated by corrupt media on all this question. That phrase, deadbeat dads. So let's just briefly explain what that is about and what it means. Deadbeat dads are people who allegedly have defaulted on maintenance or on child support payments, which have been ordered by the court. But let's go back. What has happened? Well, what's actually happened here is that in the vast majority of cases, what's actually happened is that the state has intervened in a private situation between a man and a woman who have a child or children together, and has sought to remove the father from the picture and replace him as the supporter of his, as the breadwinner and supporter, as it were, of his children, and to drive him out of the picture. And it has made a condition of them supporting his family, allegedly, that the father not have contact in very many cases. But then what they do is, having done that and put him out of the picture, they go after him to reclaim the money that they have used to break up his family, right? And they then treat him as a criminal, and he becomes a deadbeat dad. And of course, stupid journalists repeat this until it happens to themselves, and then they come running to people like me. The people out there don't know, they can't see around or into this concept. And what's actually happening is that these guys are treated as, again, criminals, quasi-criminals, as a result of a process that has nothing to do with criminality, that has no business of the state, but they have managed to intervene and intrude into it and assert power over the most intimate aspects of the life of the family, mother, child, and father, and to dispose of everything in this way and make vast amount of money for the practitioners involved, while the family is absolutely decimated in every sense.
Oh, yes, that's a very good point, John, because the Deadbeat Dads was a kind of ironic title. It was basically people who were being pursued for money that they didn't owe, and there was no controversy with the partner, but the state intervened. So that's what I made the point about third-party interlopers. In other words, who's making the claim? Who is bringing the claim against me? And what is the claim? In other words, if they were asked that question, they can't quantify what it is. Because they can't say you owe this money because you don't owe it. So they're making an assumption, and you have to deal with that assumption. But yeah, I think that was a kind of interesting diversion, and it does kind of tie into what we're talking about. But yeah, let's get back to your case now, and really tell us a bit more about that. Yeah,
it's very much of a piece. So that's really where we are. I mean, we've been in court 3 times now, and we went in on ex parte, which means that it was an application for a judicial review. And these things they have a low threshold of arguability. You can get in very easily once you make a basic case, and our case is probably the best case ever been made for breaches of the Irish Constitution. It's so clear cut, like there isn't in the Irish Constitution. There is one provision whereby an emergency can be declared, and that's when there's war or armed rebellion, and that's the only time. And this bears no resemblance to that, unless they're saying, as I've said, that it's some kind of bioweapon, and they haven't said that, so this cannot be the case. And so that's that. That's as far as the judge in assessing our application needed to read in our submission. And he should have said, okay, that should go ahead. This definitely needs to be tested. Let's go. But they've delayed, and now they're procrastinating and prevaricating their submissions and affidavits and all of this, and we have to take part in this. And there's another hearing either on Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on when the papers come, and if they do come, and if they don't come, and we have to submit papers and blah, blah, blah. And of course, it's all a circus. The lawyers are all lining up now to collect their fees, and the people's interest has been, buried. But we don't intend that to happen. We know what's going on. We've had 3 different judges now, and we've seen in each case exactly what was going on with regard to the kind of quote unquote advice we were being given and guidance we were being given. And we have our own strategy, and we are pursuing it. And we're, as you said at the outset, we're attracting a lot of hostility, but most of that is manufactured. It's all generated by the government. I've seen this before. When I got involved in the referendum in 2015 and ran foul of the LGBT goons, who have been given a special pride of place in our unfortunate country as a kind of like elite squad of thugs to protect the present government and its incumbents and every policy that they seek to pursue. I started receiving this filth in my email box every night, and it was quite interesting. Where I wrote a book about all this called "To Give Us Back the Bad Roads," and I outlined some of that stuff in the book. And I noticed a very interesting thing about it very soon. That it would come in absolute deluge all day long, say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then it would stop. And I would say, "Oh, they're finished now. They've gone away." And they would stay away all day Wednesday, Thursday. There would be nothing at all. But then Friday morning it would start again, and would continue for the weekend. So I actually then immediately saw that here you have a room full of human bots, who are feverishly churning out, like in the cottage industry, churning out filth to attack people like John Waters and Gemma Docherty. That's what they do with their lives. That's what they do with their whole existences. So that's my whole sense of all this. But we have a lot of public support from people we meet in the street. This is the ironic thing about it, Mark. That whereas if you were to simply go by what you hear about what on Twitter, I don't look at Twitter or what I get in my email. I get about 50-50 now because of that the last few days. Whereas normally most of my emails are overwhelmingly positive. They come at you in certain times. And but when we walk down the street, people are just, absolutely delighted that somebody is speaking for them and saying the truth at last. That's the thing. I've noticed this for the last few years in Ireland, like this climate, and I think it's the worldwide thing where people have been terrified out of their wits by thugs and scumbags. The Antifa people and the LGBT goon people, goon squads, that they're afraid to open their mouths about anything. And they're looking around them, who's listening. If you ask them a question, they nearly faint because they have to say something that might be dangerous. And those kind of people now come up to me and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe this. What's going on?" But thank you thank you to Gemma and you for doing this. It's amazing. And so, they think that they can scare us off. This is the funny thing, they really do. I think they're so used to having scared people that they think they can do the same to us, but they can't. It won't work.
No, it's a really good point, John, because I've seen this in action. And basically what we're talking about here is the result of the big society. A lot of this came in about 2010 when these NGOs started appearing and these empowered groups, and it started this culture of change agents. And these people were trained using the Saul Alinsky rules, Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. Saul Alinsky was a radical housing campaigner in the early 60s in America, but he was a very subversive in his tactics, and he dedicated his first book to Lucifer. So there's a lot of deception in what this is, but it's very, very kind of monotonous in a way. So in other words, yes, this happened to my friend. What she would get is a series of attacks day after day after day. Then it would stop, and on Friday it would start for the weekend, because they want to terrorize you over the weekend. And it was a pattern. I said, look, they have limited weapons. These people are not clever. All they can do is call you a racist, a fascist, and a Nazi. Maybe anti-Semitic as well. Who knows? Point is that that's all they can do. They can't do anything. So what I kind of worked out was a strategy to deal with them. And basically, it's if you mirror back to them what they're doing to you, you then become the victim and make them the oppressor. Because this sort of stuff is psychological warfare 101. That's all it is. It's what British intelligence do. It's what the 7-7 Brigade do on Twitter and Facebook.
Well, the approach I take to this is kind of like, I call it my rain strategy, you know, which is that, you know, if you're leaving some place that you've been to visit, maybe a cafe or something like that, and it started to rain while you've been in there heavily, you know, and you go out and you don't have a coat with you, you don't have an umbrella, and you're looking out and, oh my God, it's going to go wet, I'm going to get wet, I'm going to get wet. So I say, oh, well, to hell, I've got to go. So it's not going to stop, I got to go. So you start running a bit. And then within 2 minutes, you're completely saturated. What happens? Then you slow down and relax, because you're not going to get any wetter than you are. And that's the thing about abuse from these people. Once they've given you so much, that's it, they've shot their load, you know, and there's nothing else they can do to you except repeat. And it doesn't have any effect on me at all. I mean, at this stage, I don't even bother tuning. I don't listen to it. I know the look of the name. If I see a name on an email, I know it's one of these guys, you know, like I know a makey up name when I see one. And so I'm not in the slightest bit bothered by it. And neither is Gemma. This is the amazing thing. You see, there's a whole deep thing here, which is, you know, a whole other kind of realm of this thing, which is that the work that's been done, preparatory work culturally to prepare populations for all of this, which went back, I think, 30, 40 years, you know, maybe longer, I don't know, I'm quite naive about some of it. But I certainly know that the whole idea of patriotism and national attachment, the attachment between people and place, was attacked fundamentally for a very long time. And that, you know, notions of nationalism were denigrated, and you were made to feel like you were some kind of hick if you talked about love of your country and so on. And that really stuck to people, you know what I mean? I found that particularly in Ireland, you know, where people would say things to you, you know, about history and disparagingly about certain people, like our great national heroes like Pearse and Connolly and MacDonagh and Plunkett and Clark and these guys from 1916, and people would just disparage them. I'd find this with young people in particular. I'd say, hang on a minute now, what do you know about these guys? You know, who's been talking to you? And you find it's some Marxist professor in some journalism course or whatever, you know. And, so this has been done for a long time. And so people out there now are kind of rattling around. Yeah, the great Thomas Davis, one of the great patriots of Ireland from way back, the Young Irelanders, he said that, you know, he had a great speech he made one time. He said, this Ireland of ours is no sandbank. You know, it's not just a piece of territory that you walk around. And that has become kind of true, that it is a piece of territory. And now what we find is that our leaders are trying to insinuate to the people that you think this is your country. It's not your country. This is not your country. There's no such thing as your country. This is just a place you live. You're allowed to live. Why somebody like us, and maybe us, me and my friends type of thing. You know, we let you live here. This idea that you grew up with, that this is your country and you can love it, you can belong to it.
Yeah, this is the trick. What they did is they subverted love of your country and your culture into being racist.
Yeah.
It's a kind of, it's absolutely absurd, because when you go to another country, if you go to especially what the West calls a third world country, people there are very proud to show you around, and they go, oh, do you want to see this? Do you want to see, oh, have you tried this food here? Have you tried this? They're very enthusiastic. Now that's what the culture's about, right?
Yeah.
So the whole idea is to create a monoculture, and this is what they want. They want robotic people, and they want a kind of fourth world wilderness, which is the wilderness of the mind, which is being brought about through all this stuff. And political correctness as a weapon has been very useful in that, because if you look at what's happened in the last 25 years, everything's changed, but in the last 10 years it's changed dramatically. So in other words, if you express some sort of opinion it's outside the controlled narrative of acceptable public opinion, then I suppose you voted Brexit, I suppose you like Trump, I suppose you think that Elvis lives on the dark side of the moon, and they actually say those things. And it's absolutely hilarious.
I read a report about Greater Manchester Police during the week, in which I've put up a Facebook post where they're warning about that if you see people who seem to be excessively idealistic or talking about justice and things like that, please report them, because they may be guilty of hate speech or whatever. You know, this kind of stuff. Like, this is unbelievable. I mean, Orwell wouldn't dare have written a scene like that into one of his books, because nobody would find it credible. But there you go. There it is. You know, we've already accelerated past Orwell's dismal vision of humanity, and you know, so there's lots of stuff now that really we're looking at. That, like on Sunday, Easter Sunday. Easter is a huge occasion in Ireland, not just because we're a Christian country, but because related to that is the fact that our founding revolution took place on starting Easter Monday, and it was a symbolic kind of a reenactment, in a sense, of the Passion of Christ, because it was designed specifically so that the revolutionaries would try, would fail, would be executed, and would, in a sense, rise again through their own people, that their people, seeing this drama, would be moved by it to the extent that they would take their freedom finally. And that's exactly what happened. And what happened on Easter Sunday, that the Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, as we call him, it's his name, it means chieftain in Irish, which is a wonderful, beautiful designation for a leader rather than Prime Minister. But I find it sticks in my craw to say it about to use that word in relation to the present incumbent, I have to be frank. He raised a flag outside the GPO. What was the flag? The flag of the United Nations. This is like an insult. This is to rub the face of the Irish people in the dirt.
Absolutely. We talked about that the other day with Paul. I think that is such an insult, and it's basically saying you are now under occupation.
Yes.
No one will be left behind. No one will be left behind. The United Nations Agenda 2030 was the biggest threat to sovereignty of thought, movement, and action, and any kind of personal freedom ever that was put into place. Well, and people did not know what it was. People in local councils enforcing it, and basically what this COVID-19 thing is, John, as we've been talking about, is just a speeding up of this process, but a speeding up on steroids that you couldn't think would possibly even be doable.
Oh, exactly. You know? You say occupation. Well, that's exactly the feeling I had at the forecourts on Tuesday. You know, that the police, there dozens, if not hundreds, of police officers around the place, vans and cars and squad cars, armed police, SWAT teams, you name it. And that's what struck me. This is a force of occupation. These are not our police anymore. They are our people, in most of them, but they're not any longer working for us. They're working against us. We are now their prisoners, and they want us to understand that. And this was a real shock. It's like being beaten up, without anybody touching you. I just couldn't believe it. But it was unavoidable in that situation where there's a ring of steel around a courtroom in which there's nothing but two people seeking to do the job that the president failed to do a month ago. He failed to refer to the Supreme Court the most egregious and unconstitutional bill ever presented to the Irish Parliament. And we now, two people, citizens, unpaid, pro bono, are taking this case, doing his job, and we are treated like criminals in the central courthouse of our own country.
Yeah, well, that's how far we've fallen, and that's what I've been reporting on for quite some time. And I think what this is, as I've reiterated a few times, it is a psychological battle, but it's a kind of battle between good and evil, really. And we're not assuming that we're good. We're just exposing the evil, because basically what is behind this is so insidious that if people can't see it now, then it could be too late. But optimistically, I'm thinking and finding that what is being put into place and the ideas that are coming forward and the general kind of atmosphere that's being created has given me a lot of impetus to carry on with projects that I'm doing and to support, obviously, people like yourself. And basically, it's a kind of knowing that I think the time's right for a lot of this stuff. I mean, the point is about the court case is it should ignite people. That's the whole point. And that is the most disappointing thing. I've seen that outside the court, there's quite a few supporters there. But when you look at the press, I mean, all right, we've got this sort of dumbed down press, which has one narrative, which is basically from the news agencies. And all they do is they look for press releases to repeat. That's what most of these papers do now. Yeah. But I couldn't believe that so-called journalist was stood there, and the only question that he could ask you and Gemma was, why aren't you social distancing? That was just like, it was a cross between an absolute affront and comedy.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And the amazing thing is, this is something that struck me about journalism for many years now, maybe going back 15 years. I started to notice this first, that journalism had been taken over from within by forces that I didn't really understand very much until relatively recently. But one of the symptoms of it was that journalists ceased to be interested in creating interesting material, whether it was in print or on broadcast forms. So, for example, if I was to be on a TV show, I would get researchers to ringing me up, and they were more interested in making sure that my positions were correct than simply to find out whether or not I understood the issue and could speak articulately about it. Because they didn't want to let somebody on air who might actually win the argument for the wrong side. That was the primary objective of the entire research project. And so that what happened as a result of that was that programs became reduced in their quality and so on, and their interest for the viewers and listeners. And newspapers became really facile and empty, and people stopped buying them. And then they started attributing this collapse of their industry to the internet. They blamed the internet, when in fact it was largely because of their own corruption as journalists. And you see, the point about it is our hearings. I can tell you one thing, Mark, that you can say about the hearings. There have been 3 so far that involve myself and Gemma Docherty. They're sure as hell interesting. It's hammer and tongs all the way, and any journalist who was actually interested in writing down what happened would have some scintillating copy to offer his readers. But that's not what they want. They want to show Gemma Docherty and I, and me, sorry, as that's the journalist shouldn't make mistakes of that, and me as, inept, incompetent, stupid, and so on. So for them to actually write down what happened in court, they would actually have to acknowledge that we do actually know what we're talking about and what we're doing, and they sure as hell don't want to let the people know that.
No, they don't want to report what you're actually doing. They don't want to go into the validity of your case. And it's very interesting. It's like that case in Wales. It wasn't a court case. We offered to bring a court case in a little village called Fairbourne in North Wales, which was the first place in the UK to be threatened with decommissioning over rising sea levels, which weren't rising. Now, we got the world's leading expert in sea levels, Niels Axel Morner, to state publicly on a video that he would represent those people in court. He was an IPCC panelist. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He was an expert reviewer, their expert reviewer for the sea level chapter in 3 of their reports. And he got so disgusted by the fraud and the lies that they were putting into those reports that he resigned. And I sent this journalist a copy of Niels CV and his resignation letter and the 3 reports he'd written to the IPCC. And that journalist spent half an hour on the phone. And basically, he was taking notes, and I gave him fact, 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 fact. And then the headline appeared. It said, protest planned against climate change deniers talk. And it should have said, world's leading expert in sea levels offers to support Fairbairn in court over decommissioning. Yes. That would have been a kind of fair thing. And then he would have set it up and asked a question. But this is exactly what they do. It's the ad hominem attack or a logical fallacy. In other words, they make a false argument and compare you with something that's not comparable, or they attack the person. And that is their toolbox. If that's their toolbox, it's not going to last very long.
Well, you see, the strange thing is, I mean, their readership is collapsing. But now, you see, this is another interesting thing. I mean, the Irish media are actually corrupt in all kinds of ways, but they're specifically corrupt in relation to this particular hearing, because the other side, the state, in this case, it has been funding the Irish media for some time. 2 years ago, this first came to notice when it turned out that the government was launching a new plan, to what they call the 2040 plan, and this was about, essentially migration into Ireland, the demographic construction of Ireland in the coming period. And it emerged actually afterwards that the government had employed a PR company to disperse monies to newspapers and broadcasters in order that they would publish appropriate copy concerning the plan and appropriate coverage. This used to be, when I was a journalist in Dublin, this used to be called advertorial. You got a big splurge of absolute gibberish between the ads on the page, which were paid for. And this was, you wouldn't read it. Nobody ever read it. Like, it was, it's a thing in provincial papers, like in the local newspapers, but nobody ever, a new supermarket would be launched and they would write a big long splurge of nonsense about the fine vegetable section and so on. And that's kind of what happened in relation to the 2040 plan, which is possibly the most monumental thing that will have been launched in Ireland up to the present situation, because it would change, it was threatening to change the entire face of Ireland in the coming half century, and essentially in the end leave the Irish people a minority in their own country. But there was nothing about that exactly in any of the coverage whatsoever, and that was the whole purpose. So these journalists have already shown they're completely corrupt, viable, and they're bought and paid for, and they're being bought and paid for by the people who are on the other side of this action of ours. And I mean, seriously, we don't speak to them. Like, we just say no. We don't. I mean, my hope is, I intend, and if I do speak to a journalist in any time during this proceeding, it would be to tell them that I would like social distancing between me and journalists to extend to 2 kilometers rather than 2 meters.
Yes, well, that's the thing. I mean, I've found this, it's a huge problem, and there aren't really any journalists left, really. No. I mean, I don't really know it. I mean, people say Peter Hitchens, but Peter Hitchens gets some of it, but he doesn't get the whole picture. If he got the whole picture, he wouldn't be there, in my opinion.
That's the thing is, yeah, that's interesting. I like Peter, and I admire very much what he does. He's doing in this whole lockout thing. He's very brave, and he's really very great colleague. But I've noticed that he has blind spots, which I find puzzling, and he kind of dismisses certain things which he should be actually, given his general demeanor in relation to truth, he should be digging into a little bit more, in my opinion. I'm sure he'd possibly have criticisms of me as well. We've kind of had a couple of ding-dongs, nothing too serious. But I think he's a great journalist at the same time. I mean, we all have blind spots. I think blind spots can often develop because we're simply lazy, Also,
I think with this information, John, that it's kind of a bit esoteric for a lot of people, because they see the world in a different way. Once you see this global governance structure, you can't unsee it. But until you've seen it, it's not really there, because you see those people arguing over a bench in Parliament, or we do here, and we think that's democracy. It's got nothing to do with what's going on. And the COVID-19 rollout and agenda has absolutely proved that those people in Parliament are being instructed from higher above. Okay, you can say it's basically the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but look at Imperial College, look at the Johns Hopkins University, look at the rollouts that have gone before, the funding of the Rockefellers. Basically, you've got the World Economic Forum are rolling this out in real time as an exercise in real time. And they are adapting to it as it's going along and changing it. And they're telling you what the outcome's going to be already. They're telling you on their website. It's that you're going to it's called the COVID-19 strategic planning, the strategy. And if you look at that, it's absolutely astonishing. It's so barefaced what they're saying, but they're saying these things as though they're recommendations, but they're actually implementations.
I don't know.
I
don't know if people in the UK are aware of the legislation that has been enacted now in relation to infectious diseases, as they're called. I mean, essentially, that the infectious disease, for the purpose of this legislation, can be a head cold. Like if you're seen sneezing in the street into your handkerchief, you may well be, under this legislation, reported to the police, who will come to your house, take your temperature, and if you don't pass the test, take you away. And I'm not. This sounds like this sounds crazy. I know.
That's written into it, John. That's written into the legislation, and I've featured it many times on the show. Yes,
and it means they can go through every single one of your possessions. They can remove anything they want. They can, in the end, demolish your house and take you and put you in custody and incarcerate you in an institution and hold you for an indefinite period. And all of this, right? Now, this arises from something as banal as a head cold. And what we have here, COVID-19, is something slightly less banal, perhaps, than a head cold, but actually not all that much less banal, because it's something slightly above in gravity the average flu. Just tiny. I mean, the figures are that from the serology tests have emerged now consistently over a range of tests. Maybe a dozen are now being done in the world, and they've found that the crude fatality rate is 0.1 to 0.3%. The average flu is about 0.1 to 2. So that's kind of just marginally above. And this is an amazing thing, because now there's a phrase here which I know you're not particularly comfortable with, and neither am I either. It's the phrase which is in general use in a lot of these contexts, which is cultural Marxism. And I just want to use it for the way we kind of colloquially use it.
I think it adequately describes things, John. I don't think it's a problematic term. It's an accurate term, because when you look at where it came from, which was the Frankfurt School, which migrated over to New York, and those people who are involved in it, like Herbert Marcuse and Gramsci, I've read their work. And basically what they're talking about is the erosion of society and the bringing in of this new society with very subversive tactics. So cultural Marxism is good, but the only thing I'd say about it is it plays into the hands of the deep state and the people who write for The Guardian, which is the deep state, right? Because they'll say, oh, cultural Marxism, that's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Now, if you hit them with some other term like unstructured global governance, they'll go, that's a conspiracy theory, and then you can attack them on it. You see what I mean? So in other words, they'll use that as a derogatory term, and they'll say, well, you're just a racist, or you're anti-Semitic, or something like that, but you redefine the terms.
It's important also for people to actually be able to deconstruct these concepts, like, for example, conspiracy theory. This is a really interesting theory. Just before I go back to the culture of Marxism, I just want to just treat of it in a couple of moments, just because it's very interesting. Because, conspiracy theory, well, what is that? If you hadn't ever heard the phrase before and somebody said it to you, you'd think, oh, conspiracy. So it's somebody who is a theorist concerning conspiracies, right? So he investigates conspiratorial behavior. Okay, conspiracies are sinister. Okay, but the theorist himself is not sinister necessarily. In fact, not at all. There's no suggestion whatever in the actual clean phrase as it stands that he is. But what they've actually done, they've actually inverted the phrases so that all of the conspiratorial aspects, the sinister aspects of conspiracy accrue not to the conspirators, but to the theorist. You see how they did that? It's quite amazing. But now, you're the conspirator theorist. But no, I'm a theorist of your conspiracies, which are the sinister aspects. So people don't see this. And the problem is, it has become one of those hypnotic phrases which immediately puts people into a kind of a trance of fear, which they want to avoid being seen as that. So they change the subject, or they kind of say, oh, well, I don't really take that very seriously, you know, ha ha ha. You know, so this is very clever stuff. And it would be very interesting one day to find out where it all originated, you know, because it's very cunning and very, very clever. But I want to go back to the culture of Marxism, just for the purposes of, because I have other objections to the phrase, which is that it's a very limited, because it's not just Marxism. I mean, there's huge dollops of Freudianism in it as well, and other elements.
Absolutely. I wanted to make that point, John, that what we're actually dealing with here is a psychological warfare program, which came out of places like the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which was known as Freud's drawing room, basically.
Yeah.
And Freudian psychology subverted a lot of what's going on. I mean, I look at this in the whole big picture of the agenda of controlling people's minds, what it's about, and that Freud was a fraud. Basically, he was just a fraud. And basically, what you've got is the whole industry of psychiatry and psychology is formed a new kind of neurosis, and it's used by the deep state to impose neurosis on the target audience, which is the population. So in other words,
go on, sorry.
A psychological operation against the audience. So
I just thought of a good joke, actually.
Go on.
Freud is fraud for dyslexics.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
But the thing about the culture of Marxism, though, that their key tactic is, in a certain sense, to kidnap hostages. They take hostages. And those hostages they then adopt as their in a custodial, you know, paternalistic way. So they do that with women through feminism. They do it with gay people through LGBT politics. They do it.
They empower. They give power to people who actually aren't groups, but they create these groups.
Yes.
So there's no such thing as an LGBT community. There never has been.
No.
So they refer to it as a community.
They use them as human shields, ideologically speaking, in order to protect their agenda and allow them to advance across the territory that they're trying to claim, which they are claiming the entire Western civilization in this way. And here, this is now the COVID-19 thing is a really unexpected twist to this, because up to now, those victim groups, which you might call in Marxist terms the kind of neo-proletariat, you know, they replaced the proletariat in the Marxist paradigm, because Marx identified this as the group that would kind of, you know, acquired ownership or dictatorship over history. And they're doing this with the victim groups. So of course it's the custodians, it's the controllers who have control, by definition. But what they've done now is really unexpected, because up to that coalition of minorities, if you like, previously had an opponent, by definition, within that paradigm. And that was, generally speaking, obviously, males, white males, straight males, whites, straight people, Christians, those groups, right? They were the oppressors to equate to the capitalist in the Marxist paradigm, right? And that's how the cultural Marxist model kind of truly works. Now, here's the interesting twist, that in this particular phase, COVID-19, they have temporarily adopted a new group, and that is the elderly, who in our case in Ireland, they're mostly white people, they're older, a lot of them are men. So they're not the conventional cultural Marxist favored protege. And so what they've done now is most unlikely, because I mean, like, you know, within the same paradigm, like 6 months ago in Ireland, they were discussing when they were going to start the process of seeking to legalize euthanasia, which would have mean putting down as soon as possible most of these older people when they got to a certain age, because of course they would create cultural conditions which made, you know, self-destruction a form of duty, as has happened in other cultures. And that can be easily done in the kind of conditions that they've created for all kinds of other reasons. But now they're actually adopting these people and they're trying to save their lives, even though, you know, if you're 97, you know, you possibly don't expect to live all that long anyway. But they're actually saying that if they can save one person for 1 hour type of thing, then it is worth, you know, 27 points on, you know, the Dow Jones. And they would not sacrifice one life for 100 points on the Dow Jones or which is a nonsensical comparison, but that's the kind of way they talk, because it's moral blackmail they use. It's one of the instruments they use to push their agenda forward. And they're using these old people now as human shields. But in reality, sadly, as I wrote 6 weeks ago in First Things, because it was the first thing I wrote about all of this, was that I noticed that in Italian hospitals, there were triage protocols being whispered about, which actually involved not treating people over certain ages. And in the beginning, it was about people over 80. It came down to 75, 70. And in the end, there was a doctor from Israel speaking on Israeli television who said that in the hospital he was working in Parma in Italy, had a rule that anybody over 60 should not be treated. Should be, in other words, they would just be left to die. Comfort care, I think they call it, or something like that. And
yeah,
so that's kind of what's going on now. It's an extraordinary confidence trick, which portrays these people as somehow compassionate, caring people, when they are the greatest tyrants and monsters that we have ever seen in our civilization, possibly, certainly since the middle of the last century. And I think most people are duped in a way that the people even then weren't duped. The German people were duped to a high degree, but I don't think that they had they had nothing on this. That the level of credulity on the part of ordinary people in this situation now is as a result of the corruption of the media in particular. I mean, that's a whole new element, because now we have a media which is dying and entirely dependent on state support. And so
it's a media-driven agenda, John. Everything about this agenda is media-driven. The COVID-19 agenda is a media-driven agenda. It would not exist without the media. No. Because it's not even a pandemic. It's been redefined as a pandemic. It's that's not right. A pandemic. There's not enough people to be involved. But the criminality that's going on, and this I think is a very important point. When you see these empty hospitals and these nurses dressing up, acting out these kind of scenes from Titanic and doing these kind of choreographed stage routines, these are the same people who are basically involved in a fraud. I'm not saying all of them, but they're involving themselves in a fraud in detailing these deaths as COVID-19 when they're not. They're saying people died with most people. We're probably going to die with coronavirus. I know I certainly would if I died now, because I've had a virus recently. So I'd die with coronavirus. So I'd be a COVID-19 death, right? Now, yeah. I know three people at least who've been diagnosed as having died from COVID-19 because they went in the hospital, they didn't have it. Then all of a sudden they've got it and they've died. Now we know that people are getting put on ventilators. 80% of people get put on ventilators who are dying. Now, the thing is, these vacuous kind of people who've been mentored into this system are the ones who are posing about in their spare time, going onto social media, making these kind of dance routines up, doing this vacuous, narcissistic, waste of time nonsense. They are the people who are putting do not resuscitate on people's beds, basically. Yeah, now, that's what's sinister to me about it. In other words, there's a disconnect with these people, and that's the whole system that we're in. The communitarian system is a disconnect. It's where the actual right and wrong becomes an opinion. So in other words, well, I say this to you, and it's a fact, okay? So you give someone a fact and they'll go, well, that's your opinion, or I don't want to see it like that. Well, no, when something's an empirical fact, it's a fact. 2 and 2 is 4. Well, I don't see it like that way. Sorry you feel like that about it, but I don't. And that is the end of natural law. That's the end of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a movie, I remember seeing a scene from I think it was Reservoir Dogs, and there's one, it's a torture scene, and there's a guy tied to a chair. And this guy, I think one other guy anyway, with a knife is dancing around him, and the Steelers Wheel song, Stuck in the Middle with You, is playing, And that comes into my mind when I see those scenes of dancing, because in the situation that has been created, where we are told, where people are dying, okay? And they're dying mainly in nursing homes. Like 70% of the deaths in Ireland have been in nursing homes, which is very suspicious in lots and lots of ways. But of course, there's no press to investigate it anymore. But the whole the optics of this is like that it is a form of gaslighting. That they really are almost like the whole population is being subjected to a form of torture, where you have people now. I mean, I find it unbearable, Mark. When I think about it in these terms. And I was speaking to somebody this morning in an interview I did, and it just, I said to him, does all of us, at some point as we grow older, we start to think about those moments before we die, and what would they be like? What will they be like? And it's a very dark and sad thing in some ways, but in other ways, if you're a Christian and so on, it's something else as well. But one of the things for sure that you think is going to happen has happened with my mother and a couple of years ago and so on, is that everybody is there around the bed and you hold the person's hand and you pray and if they can hear you, you speak to them, and if they can't hear you, you speak to them, and so this is something like is fundamental to our civilization, and this has been obliterated by these curs that we call leaders. These last few weeks, people are dying alone in their beds without the comforting hand of a loved one with whom they have spent their lives or half their lives, their children, their grandchildren, their wives, their husbands. This is unimaginable cruelty. It is unforgivable cruelty. This is why I don't take any quarter from people who tell me we should be kind, we should be polite to the police. I'm very sorry. I don't think we should be polite to people who are policing this. I think we should tell them in no uncertain terms what we think of them. We should tell them that they're a force of occupation in our country. We do not want them. Leave us alone. Go away. You have no authority. We have a constitution. We insist upon it. We don't care what you say. We don't care what the Chief Justice says. We don't care what the Taoiseach says. We don't care what the Minister for Justice, so-called, says. You are a tyrant. Get out of my sight.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the thing. The 9 rules of policing. One of the 9 rules of policing is that the police are the public and the public are the police.
Yes.
They're meant to be inseparable from the real public interest, not the fake public interest.
They're
which they enforce.
That's very true in Ireland, of all places. I mean, we never had armed police on our streets until the last 2 or 3 weeks, and now they're everywhere with the rifles sticking up from their jeans, in plain clothes with flak jackets with Garda on the back. But our police force, apart from fighting terrorism, especially units like that, did not have arms, and now they have. And this is because of the importation of a commissioner from Northern Ireland, which is a deeply corrupt, the most corrupt police force ever to stand in Europe was their Royal Ulster Constabulary, a brutal police force, and he was a member of that force. And he is importing now into our country, which has never seen anything like this kind of culture. And so, this is, again, the part of the concept of occupation that you mentioned. This is exactly what it is. But there's also this hypnotic thing, in which these, there's first of all the softening up process, the love bombing process, and then this tension is in the second phase is the gaslighting phase, if you like, in which there's a kind of a juxtaposition of something soft and something harder, like a condensation hitting a cold pane, like a steam hitting a cold pane and turning to condensation. That idea, a picture, like an image, should I say, of a grandparents looking at their waving to their grandchildren through a plate glass window or through a windscreen. That's as close as they're going to get, and this is as a result of a diktat of the government, And the subtext says these people could be among the dead within a week, but that's just life or whatever. We say so anyway. We don't care, and that every and be proud of this and thank the frontline staff for doing these things and for and then the final stage is when the iron fist is out, and you see the armed police with their guns sticking out of their belts and they're telling you it's not your country anymore. That's kind of the sequence. And there's a hypnotic thing, you see, which takes place in them. If you look at the kind of imagery, the words, deadly, it's a deadly disease, 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 deadly disease. And then, the new normal, no normal won't come back normal, no new normal, new normal. This is the hypnotic kind of trance. And the journalists are, of course, the scum of the earth, are employed to do this. And if you walk around the paths, I know around here, and I'm sure it's true over there, they have these figures on the ground, matchstick men in white, painted on the ground with an arrow in between showing 2 meters. It's probably 2 yards over there. You're still in the civilized world. And we have these, but they actually resemble nothing so much as those chalk marks that the murder investigators paint around the corpse of a murder victim. And that's to drum into your head. It's a deadly disease. It's a deadly disease. It's a deadly disease. It's a deadly disease. Or deadly, new normal, deadly, normal, deadly, normal. And you are dazed and confused as you walk along. This is exactly what's going on until somebody snaps their finger. And that's what John Waters and Gemma Docherty are doing with this case above all else, because we certainly don't expect justice in the corrupt Irish courts, but we'll sure as hell want to wake our people up so that we can actually get our country back, take our country back as Pearse and Connolly and Clark and MacDonagh took it back over 100 years ago. And we intend to do the same thing while there is still a breath in us.
That's great, John. I thought I'd stay out of the picture there, because that was a great way of ending this particular chat. We've had quite a few chats over the past week or so, and they've all been fascinating. But I wanted to let you outline what this is really about and your passion and everything. It's really shone through there. And I'm fully behind you. I know a lot of our listeners are. Ironically, we've had quite a few trolls in there tonight, which we don't usually get. So you're obviously stirring up a bit of controversy.
Nice to be with you. Nice to see you. You're very welcome.
I think they're mostly gone now. But the thing is about the troll is that
we're coming to get you. We're coming to get you. Give it the clap, girls. Give it the clap. Come on, boys. Come and get it. Go ahead, Tom. Make my game.
That's exactly right. I mean, but the thing is that the trolls are always off topic, so it's always about an ad hominem, about your appearance or what you perceive to have done. It's never about what we're actually talking about, because that's off boundary. They can't actually argue with it, and that's what I say when people say, that's a conspiracy theory. I suppose you think Elvis lives on the moon. I say, well, which of the facts are you disputing? Which facts are you disputing? How are you going to rebut what I'm saying? Which bit isn't true? And then they back off. But that's the way of this. It's a very simplistic sort of mimetic warfare. And basically, your point there was very good, because I've seen the look in those policemen's eyes, those newly trained ones, and there is nothing there. These people are not there to help you. These people are enforcers for a foreign power, and they don't appear to give a damn. When I saw... Sorry, go on.
Sorry, just when you're on the team again of the conspiracy theory, I just want to put this to everybody who's listening. 1 year ago, if I was to sit here in front of you, Mark, on your show and say the following, that in a very short time, people would be locked in their homes under police watch because of the flu, They would have their shopping checked coming out of the supermarket in case they had bought a box of chocolates, for example. They would be, if they were caught reading a book on a park bench, they would be told to move along. If they were lying in the sun on the grass on a beautiful spring afternoon, the police would tell them to move on, that this was not permitted behavior. If I said that to you a year ago, what would people say? They would say it was a what, mister? A conspiracy theory, mister.
Yeah, you've been watching too many of those Hollywood movies. You've been watching too many of those sci-fi movies. Where are you getting these conspiracy theories from? You think you better check your thinking. But basically, no one would believe the situation that we're in. But ironically, or kind of conversely, I suppose, I was kind of prepared for it. I was just wondering when it was going to happen. because I was wondering how it was going to be rolled out. Rolling it on the back of seasonal flu, well, that's quite a new one. Rolling it out on the back of basically a fraud, which is what it is. I'm not saying there's no such thing as the virus. I'm saying that what they're rolling it out on the back of is entirely fraudulent, and it's unprecedented. It's something that's never been seen ever, even in wartime. Nothing like this has ever happened. And so this is a defining moment. And I think it's very, very good to be fully alive at the moment, fully alive. I mean, absolutely on the ball and feeling very exhilarated, because I do a lot of the time these days. I actually feel like this is the time now. This is the defining time. This is what we've all been waiting for. It's like show business. I've been hanging around for 25 years. Now I've got a gig, you know. Great. So let's leave it on a positive note, you know.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, it's a strange thing in my life, you know. It's weird because I remember one of my best friends when I was in school years and years ago. I met him. I hadn't seen him for a long time, and he'd become a missionary out in Asia, and was involved with working in the streets and over there in one of the cities over there, and we were having coffee, and we had been really close friends, and he said at one point he said, you know, John, he said, I think you haven't really fulfilled your vocation. There's something about you that tells me that you're not really totally ad idem with your ambition or your sense of yourself. It's like you have something to do that you cannot find. I was kind of quite taken aback by that, you know, because I wasn't aware of that. But now I think he was so right, that this is something that all of my life I have been preparing for. Because I always had different ambitions, you know, to be a writer of different kinds, to become a playwright. And I did write plays years ago, and would like to write some more when I get some spare time, if ever I do again. And also I have, you know, been trying to write a novel for me. I've written a novel, but I'm not happy enough to publish it, you know, and I've written short stories, and that's kind of, you know, that's the kind of writer I wanted to be for a long time. But every time I tried to get away from what I've been doing to do that, something intervenes and prevents me doing it. It pulls me back to this story that started maybe 25 years ago with me writing in the wake, after my daughter was born, writing about the corruption of the family courts and following that line right through to the present, which is exactly why I ended up here. And so now the strange thing is, I've written, as you said, I've written 10 books, and they're all non-fiction. And they're all about Ireland, pretty much, you know, and they're all about stuff like this, you know, and about economics and culture and religion and all kinds of stuff. It all fits together in a strange way. It's a kind of like, I suppose if you read them all together, it would be a kind of history of the past 50 years in Ireland, and in a different, or a you know, a kind of a secret history, more like of those years. And now I realized actually this was my life. You know, this was my vocation, but this is the part that my friend noticed that was missing. This is the true meaning of it, the culmination, the denouement. You know, I have a great friend, Desmond Fennell, the great philosopher of Ireland, you know, and he's an elderly man now, and I hope he is well. I haven't been in touch with him for a while. I've written a few times, and he may be ill, I hope not. But he is a brilliant man who has written many books, but has been ignored by the Irish establishment because he tells the truth. And the last time we met, you know, we were sitting out in Docherty, in the village I lived in, and outside in a sunny day. And I said to him, Desmond, you know, you must, to be your age now and to be, you know, at the end of this, it's a very strange time. It must be very hurtful to see your country in coming to ruins. And he laughed and he said, you know, John, no. He said, you know, I'm an historian also. And he says, historians love to be around at the end of an epoch. And I kind of can identify with that a little, because I do think that this is dying. This is the death of something corrupt and rotten in the world. And that implies also a new beginning. We come to the end, but there is a new beginning. And what we have to do above all is make sure the beginning is our beginning, not theirs. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to bring this old world to an end and replace it overnight. That we will wake up one morning and the world will have changed before our eyes. That's what they're doing. I mean, even here in the most banal ways, you mentioned AI, artificial intelligence, like they've been fitting 5G, while everybody else is told they cannot do anything that is not essential or buy anything that is not essential. They've been fitting 5G to lampposts and all this.
It's a theatre, really, John, isn't it? It's a theatre, what's going on. It's been
well,
rolled out as a theatre because it doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
Well, it does make sense if you think of that AI thing, that the 5G is to enable us to change the world into their way of.
No, what I meant was the actual draconian measures that have been put in place against the public don't make sense. But the artificial intelligence thing is what they're pushing. What it is, the World Bank, they've been working on this climate change agenda for a long time. Any beneficial crisis that will speed up where they really want to go is going to be pushed and pushed and pushed. There's lots of interested parties behind this beneficial crisis. The World Bank, the IMF, the digitization of currency. They can't wait for this to happen because then it becomes more centralized. They want universal basic income. They want all of the serfs on the plantation to be under absolute control. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's exactly how these people think. They've got a lot of money and they do like having power. And what is very apparent, I've listened to some of these people, listen to what David Lang said in 1992 about sustainable development. He said, we need to reduce this to some kind of simplistic definition for the cannon fodder out there. And that simplistic definition is sustainable development, meaning the mixture of development on the one hand through the banks, who are the fire, and environment on the other hand, which is the water. The fire and the water alchemically bring forth this allegorical mixture, which is basically what they're talking about. That's what sustainable development is. It's this Rosicrucian principle. But that doesn't matter. The banks are the fire, the environmentalists are the water, and the banks steer the environmentalists. So the globalists need the anti-globalists to implement their policies. So they create the opposition groups like Extinction Rebellion to implement the policies of the globalists. Now they've speeded it up. They've got a beneficial crisis. They've got control of pretty much the whole financial system. This is the fourth world wilderness, the wilderness of the mind. It's the boundaryless world where there is no beginning and no end. There is no history or any past. There's really no future. But basically what this is about is quite interesting because this philosophical worldview cannot work. And it cannot work because the people imposing it have not got they don't pack the gear to do it. They have the power, the perceived power, but this has not been thought out well enough. It's not been thought out well enough. It's a template that's infiltrated every country on the planet through NGOs and shadow government and all the rest of it, all this stuff we cover. But it can never fully work. And that is why they need to impose this kind of preparedness exercise on the public to see how much will they take? How much will they take? Yeah. Well, they seem to be taking the whole lot. Yeah.
That's very interesting because, I mean, essentially that, systems that, if we were to evolve in technological societies, of course, to develop in a democratic way formulations for how such a society might operate would be a very interesting process. But they've never been prepared to engage in that. This is imposed from the top down. It's by coercion. They're using state coercion now to impose paradigms which are actually belonged and have been conceived by very rich and powerful people, and they're being imposed on the populace by implicit and sometimes explicit coercion. But it's very interesting, that it means essentially that everything is rendered sinister now because there's no other meaning to this when you have a coercive force behind it. But for example, when I was 30 years ago, when I started writing in the Irish Times, I remember if you were to go back in my articles now, you'd actually find some articles about the concept of universal basic income. And at the time, I was actually quite in favor of it for the reason that I felt that in the coming technological age, we would need to find ways of actually dispersing income in society in the absence of work as we then understood it. And that we need to then reformulate very complex methods by which you could actually have a kind of what I used to call a redistribution of dignity in life. And you would actually have to introduce concepts of work which have to do with the public good and mentoring of young people, and all kinds of wholly new practices in human existence culturally, so that we would develop a different kind of society from the bottom up. Now, what's actually happened now is that all of these things can no longer be considered because of what's happening. Anything like that. I'm not saying that my ideas are necessarily better or as good as anybody else's, but just that everybody can come up with ideas from the ground up like this. But for, say, to take something like universal basic income, this idea can now never be mentioned again, frankly, in my view, even though I was a supporter of it, because it is now part of this program of coercion. Because we already have seen it. This is in Ireland, people are being paid €350 a week, which is more than they would get on social welfare during the lockdown. But of course, that will diminish when the lockdown is, a little bit goes along a bit further on, and they have been trapped and they've lost their jobs. But my point is that they have now ensured that there's actually, in the future, it will be very difficult to trust any, even if we escape from this, it will be very difficult to trust any visionary who is proposing something for our society, because of the threat of coercion, which will always exist through, social credit systems and so on, which have been experimented on in China, and we should be seeing them coming to a town near us very soon, whereby you will be penalized if you don't subscribe entirely to the ideological agenda which is promoted by the establishment. And you could find yourself arriving at the airport one morning and being asked if you have your vaccination certificate for COVID-22, and say, oh, I didn't know that one had come out yet. Well, I'm very sorry, you can't travel today then, sir, because COVID-22 is now a notifiable disease. And in fact, you have to come with me now and talk to the medical authorities here at the airport, who will take care of your child. We'll take care of your child, but you can be taken away. So your child would be quite safe with us, sir. You should be free again in a week or two. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly why they've enabled themselves to do that. I mean, that's the most worrying thing about those laws that are going to be in for the next 2 years, in that any agent of the state can come up to you, like you said, and say, you appear to have a cold. We're going to take you to a place of detention. What's a place of detention? Well, it's wherever we take you. And once you're in there, if we don't like your thinking, I think I've been checking your Twitter feed. I think you're a bit of a conspiracy theorist, aren't you? Oh, yeah. And we need to talk to you about your thinking. Yeah. So what sort of thoughts are you having? You seem to have very negative thoughts, and you seem to have a lot of anger issues. You seem to be very angry. Why are you so angry? All this kind of stuff can be brought up. And then,
are you on medication? Yes.
Yes, all that stuff. But the point is that then they can either section you with one health professional. Well, what's a health professional? In
Ireland, to be a lawyer. By the way, it's not even a health professional. It's a lawyer. Can actually. Yeah. Oh, well, in this legislation, they want for all my life, I've been hearing people calling themselves progressive. So we're arguing in favor of the mentally ill and the necessity to, really to reform these are barbaric laws in relation to mental illness and detention of psychiatrically ill patients and so on. And we've reformed them in many, many ways. And now it's quite difficult to section somebody. But then in one fell swoop in this legislation, these progressives have set the clock back to before I was born, to 1952, and abolished every single part of the evolutionary program that was introduced since 1953.
Well, the thing is, John, I think you're being a bit selfish here, because no one will be left behind. That's the UN mantra. No one will be left behind. You're not allowed to be outside the accepted corridor of opinion. The narrow corridor of accepted opinion is getting narrower.
I think that means that when the paddy wagon takes off, no one will be left behind.
That's right. So we've got to be left behind, because I want to be left behind, you see. I want to be left behind and left alone to do what I want to do. And I think what I'm doing is pretty productive. And I like the people out there.
The right to be let alone. One of the most fundamental rights there is. Perhaps the most fundamental right there is, after the right to life, is the right to be let alone. In other words, get the hell out of my space and leave me in peace.
That's right. And that's what there's a lot of people in America thinking like that. I do 2 shows on RBN Radio, which is based in Texas, 8 p.m. UK time, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I do this live stream every Wednesday at 9 p.m, every Sunday at 9 p.m on windowsontheworld.net. Yes, do have a look on the website, go into the archive, and I'll be back very soon. I'm going to give John the last word. And yeah, go for it, John.
Well, it's a real shock to be in this place right now, and I didn't ever imagine that I would end up in an Orwellian dystopia for real. But here we are, and we've got to just deal with it. I mean, I've been reading about particularly the Eastern European experiences for many years, and I've been very much influenced by people like Havel and Solzhenitsyn. And, I feel those guys with me in these days. I feel those guys walking the corridors of the courtrooms that we have visited, myself and Gemma, over the last couple of weeks. I hear their footsteps just behind me. So we are not afraid. We're not afraid. We are here to take you down, boys. And take you down we will.
Yeah, more and more people will jump on board and get involved with this. I think that, yeah, we're in defining times, unprecedented times. I want to leave you with something from the Nag Hammadi scriptures. I've read this before. The Nag Hammadi scriptures were discovered in Upper Nile, Egypt in 1945. They were found in a jar and they were written in Greek, and they're thought to have been from 200 to 400 AD, but they don't really know. But they're apocryphal. They're early Christian texts and very, very fascinating. And I love this quote, and it's from it's from a discussion between God, what's his name? Trismegistus. I'm getting a bit tired here. Trismegistus and his disciples. Hermes Trismegistus and his disciples. And it's from the Nag Hammadi. It says, the world will be desolate. People will prefer lightness. People will prefer darkness to light and death to life. No one will gaze up to heaven. Well, mainly because they're looking at their mobile phones most of the time. But the godly will be considered mad, and the impious will be honored as wise. The coward will be considered strong, and the good person will be punished as a criminal. Concerning the soul and the things of the soul, and whatever has to do with immortality, these things will not only be considered to be ridiculous, they will also be regarded as being nothing. People like this will expose themselves to the ultimate danger to their souls. A new law will be established, and the good spirits will depart, but the wicked angels will remain among people and be with them and lead them recklessly into what is evil and into godlessness, war and pillage, by teaching them things contrary to nature. In those days, the earth will be unstable, and people will not sail the sea or discern the stars in heaven. Every sacred word of God will become silent, and the air will be unhealthy. This is the senility of the world: godlessness, dishonor, contempt for noble words. The first and only deity has seen what has happened. He formulates his plan, a good plan against the chaos. He eradicates error and eliminates evil, sometimes drowning in a flood, at other times burning it in a conflagration, and at still other times subduing it with wars and plagues, until he brings of this work, the birth of the world. The restoration of nature of the pious and the good has no beginning, even as his nature, which is his will, has no beginning. God's nature is will, and his will is the good. Now, I think that's a brilliant quote, and I'll tell you why. Because it talks about many things that have just happened, but also it goes into this idea that behind everything that's gone on, before any evil came in, any bad intent came into the unified field, then there was this field which was basically about good energy. And that good energy has been interrupted and subverted. But that good energy will be there when the subversion has been taken down. I think that's the point. Bit of a philosophical one, but a nice place to end it. Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. It's lovely to talk to you.
That's great.
I hope we can speak in a time which is, there is more light and more hope and more courage on behalf of the general people, because they deserve to be free.
Yes. Well, that's absolutely it. And I'll be in touch with you, John. Thanks a lot for that. I think it was enjoyed and appreciated by the listeners and the viewers. So thanks a lot for listening. We'll be back. Well, I'll be back tomorrow at 8 p.m. on RBN, Republic Broadcasting Network, and 9 p.m. Sunday at windowsontheworld.net. Thanks very much and good night.
Good night.